In this series of lectures, we wrap up criminal homicide with the last theory to consider, the felony murder rule. By way of brief review, in our examination of all the criminal homicides we've classified, let's look at the defendant's mens rea at the time of the homicide. If defendant had the intent to kill, it could evoke murder to and malice through that express intent to kill. Or the intent to kill might be elevated up to murder one through premeditation. Or we saw that it might be mitigated or reduced to voluntary manslaughter because of the extenuating circumstances of heat of passion or extreme emotional disturbance, depending upon the jurisdiction. If there's no intent to kill, there might have been intent to commit serious bodily harm, a severe beating perhaps. Then we know that murder two's malice includes the intent to commit serious bodily harm. Well, we also learned that even if there were no intent to kill, no intent to commit serious bodily harm, we looked at the kinds of criminal homicides that might be resulting from those mens rea. Where a defendant exhibited depraved heart, it could be murder two. Less grave the exposure or without subjective appreciation of the risk, and the crime might be less with involuntary manslaughter under a theory of gross negligence. Now let's turn to the last theory of criminal homicide, what we call the felony murder rule. This is where we hold defendant liable for any death that occurs during the commission of or attempted commission of an inherently dangerous felony. Let's take someone who's committed the crime of obtaining property by false pretenses. Remember our kid White who scammed Safeway out of $19,000 as he kept using a closed ATM debit card? Let's suppose now on leaving one of the Safeways with money in his pocket from the scam, White runs over a pedestrian in the parking lot, killing him. Could we use the theory of felony murder as one of the theories to make White guilty for the death? No, this couldn't be felony murder because the felony that is at the heart of the crime isn't inherently dangerous. Obtaining property by false pretenses is not a dangerous felony, and so a death that occurs during this crime wouldn't trigger felony murder. And that's the point of the felony murder rule. The man-endangering state of mind is rooted in the fact that defendant is engaging in a dangerous felony, not just any felony. The malice for murder doesn't come from an intent to kill or an intent to commit serious bodily harm or even depraved heart behavior. It comes specifically from defendant's intent to commit that inherently dangerous felony. Any death that occurs during that felony should be his responsibility. That's the theory. And that's why my silly example of killing someone when obtaining property by false pretenses couldn't be felony murder. It would have to be criminal homicide using a different theory. If there's going to be criminal homicide, it would have to be from a traditional notion, probably of gross negligence for involuntary manslaughter. That's, of course, assuming he was speeding, that he wasn't just negligent, and not just because defendant was in the middle of committing a non-dangerous crime. Now let's change the facts. I'm not even going to say slightly change the facts, because this is a big change. Change the facts so that instead of fraud, defendant is committing a robbery of a grocery store. Now, the felony that defendant is committing is inherently dangerous in general, and his man-endangering state of mind comes from that desire to commit the robbery. There are two basic policies that underlie the felony murder rule. The first is that we think people who intend to commit inherently dangerous felonies, they're really bad people. Therefore, we want to hold them strictly liable for any deaths that occur during these crimes. As the argument goes, a person who's going to embark on a dangerous crime like robbery or burglary, for example, should be responsible for any death that arises during it. Some dangerous felonies are so obviously dangerous that states have specifically singled them out to be named in their Murder One statutes. And if it is a felony that is specifically named, or what we say enumerated in the Murder One statute of that state, as robbery and burglary generally are, then that death that results during that burglary or robbery will be Murder One, and possibly with it the death penalty if the state has a death penalty. You remember the Mr. and Mrs. Lamb crimes? Those were the crimes or the felonies at common law. Well, from those, we can glean inherently dangerous felonies. The inherently dangerous felonies at common law that were part of the Mr. and Mrs. Lamb crimes include burglary, arson, rape, robbery, and mayhem. We sometimes think of them as barroom felonies, those inherently dangerous felonies from the common law. But it's misleading to think that these are the only felonies that could trigger felony murder under a murder one statute modernly. States often include a host of other dangerous felonies. Kidnapping, for example, is the most common addition, but California adds train wrecking, carjacking, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor. If a death occurs during any of those felonies and all the elements are met, it's murder one. All of these felonies share a common trait. They feel inherently dangerous in that you can imagine that there are numerous ways that someone could die during the commission of these crimes. Let's take arson, for example. Defendant intends to burn a house down and he carries it out. That's a crime that on a superficial level is a destruction of property. So what makes it inherently dangerous? Well, I think we could imagine all sorts of scenarios where someone might die during that arson. A homeowner or family member might die during the blaze or die from jumping back into the house to protect family or valuables or pets. A neighbor might die trying to help that family, or a firefighter might die trying to put out the fire. We see the same analysis in burglary. Generally, it's a very dangerous crime because a homeowner might engage in a struggle with the burglar, die defending his home. There might be a shootout, or a security officer might be killed surprising the burglar. Even someone on the second floor of a home listening to a burglar on the first floor might clutch her heart and die from fright. So that's the first reason. There is a man-endangering state of mind if you embark on this dangerous felony. The second policy reason for having the felony murder rule is going to sound weird, but it's every bit as important. Felony murder serves as a deterrent to would-be criminals. We want our felons to commit their felonies as safely as possible. The implicit message to felons is, if you're going to commit a burglary, try to make sure nobody's home when you do it. Do it as safely as possible. Or we might think, going to commit a robbery or a carjacking, leave your victim alive after you take the property. There's no need to kill that person. That's the measure of deterrence we're talking about. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is really ridiculous. Burglars aren't going to be thinking about that. They're just going into the house to take or commit a felony inside. But actually, that's not true. After the felony murder rule was implemented in the 1960s, this country saw a drop in deaths during the burglaries. Professional burglars actually attempted to commit their burglaries when no one was at home. That's the deterrent value. But of course, the felony murder rule adds that if someone dies during this dangerous felony, no matter how safely our felon tried to commit it, then the first policy is in effect. We're going to hold that felon strictly liable for the death that occurred. Why? Because the felon engaged in a very man-endangering act of committing this dangerous felony. And that's what murder is all about, a man-endangering state of mind.